The wind howled across the ice plains of Nihilus 6, a relentless force that cut through flesh and bone like a blade. The sky, dark and heavy, churned with storm clouds, promising another merciless night. Snow swirled in thick, chaotic flurries, burying the past, the dead, and the forgotten. Amidst the wasteland, a lone figure crouched by a dying fire. Sharon shivered violently, her iridescent chitin dulled by frost, her breath coming in weak, shallow gasps. The last scraps of fabric she had were now wrapped around her child, a small, trembling bundle pressed against her chest. She curled around him, shielding him from the cold with her own body. Her forearms clutched him tighter as the wind stole what little warmth remained. She had nothing left. The fire flickered, then sputtered out. The dark closed in. A crunch of snow. Sharon barely registered the sound at first, too numb to react. But then, another footstep. Heavy. Measured. Human. A blue light cut through the storm, a handheld scanner sweeping over the snowdrift where she lay. Then a voice. Deep. Steady. Still alive? She barely had the strength to lift her head. A towering figure in a weathered exosuit stood before her, the glare of his visor reflecting the ice. His breath misted in the air, his rifle slung low but ready. Commander Elias Voss knelt, his scanner flickering between her and the bundle in her arms. His expression was unreadable behind the helmet, but she felt the hesitation, the moment of assessment. A decision was being made. Her cracked lips parted. No sound came. He didn't wait for an answer. Stay with me, Elias muttered, pulling a thermal injector from his belt. He pressed it against the exposed side of her neck. A sharp hiss. A rush of warmth flooded her veins, dulling the pain but not the exhaustion. Her child whimpered, barely stirring. Shit, Elias exhaled. He switched channels on his comm. I need med support at my location. 2 survivors, severe hypothermia. The reply came swiftly. You're bringing in aliens now? The disapproval was thick, laced with tension. 2 survivors, Elias repeated coldly. Silence. Then, understood. ETA 5 minutes. Sharon's vision blurred, but she felt herself being lifted, her child still clutched to her chest. Elias adjusted his grip, holding her carefully, his steps firm as he moved through the snow. Her voice cracked. Why help? Elias didn't look down. Because no one else will. The outpost was barely more than a fortified bunker, a relic from the colony days before Nihilus 6 was abandoned to frost and war. Inside it was dimly lit, the walls lined with survival gear, rations, and an assortment of weapons. The air carried the scent of heated metal and synthetic fuel. Elias carried Sharon straight to the med bay, where a woman in a tattered uniform was already setting up a heat pod. Damn it, Voss, she muttered. You're really trying to piss off Tern. Elias ignored her, laying Sharon onto the pod's cushioned surface. The machine hummed as the heat sensors activated, scanning her vitals. Her exoskeletal frame barely reacted to the warmth at first, but slowly, she stopped trembling. Elias turned to the medic. How bad? The woman ran a quick scan. She's lucky you found her when you did. Her core temp is barely above fatal. The kid's worse. Elias exhaled sharply and turned to Sharon. He needs treatment. Sharon hesitated before loosening her grip. A small, fragile body was revealed, a boy, barely past infancy, his skin an icy shade of blue. The medic's expression softened. Poor thing. She carefully took the child and set him into a separate pod. The machine beeped, initiating controlled rewarming. Elias watched, jaw tight. Sharon studied him, her tired eyes narrowing. You risk much? He folded his arms. Letting you die wasn't an option. She said nothing, but her gaze didn't waver. A sharp knock echoed through the bunker. Elias stiffened. The door slid open, revealing a man in a black tactical coat. Tall. Broad. Eyes like steel. Lieutenant Rourke. He didn't look at Sharon. His focus was on Elias. You know Tern will hear about this, Rourke said flatly. Elias held his ground. Then he hears. He's not going to like it. Elias shrugged. Not my problem. Rourke exhaled, looking between him and the aliens. You always were a stubborn bastard. Elias didn't respond. They both knew what this meant. Terran ruled what little civilization remained on Nihilus 6. His mercenaries controlled food, supplies, and warmth. If he wanted, he could cut Echo Resurgence off from all of it. Let them starve. Let them freeze. And Terran had made his stance on refugees very clear. Elias glanced at Sharon, at her child. Then back at Rourke. We don't leave people to die. Rourke sighed, rubbing his temple. You're going to war over this, Voss. Elias met his gaze. Then so be it. The lieutenant shook his head, muttering something under his breath before stepping back toward the door. I'll stall Terran as long as I can. But you better be ready. Elias nodded. The door hissed shut. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the med pods. Sharon watched him, exhaustion thick in her gaze. But beneath it, there was something else. Something like trust. Elias crossed his arms, exhaling. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, at least for this moment, 2 lives had been saved. And that was enough. The tension inside the bunker was thick, pressing down like the weight of an incoming storm. The hum of the heat pods filled the room, steady and constant, a fragile barrier between survival and the freezing death outside. Sharon's child stirred inside the rewarming chamber, his tiny limbs twitching as life crept back into him. The mother, still weak, sat up with effort, her dark eyes locked on the human who had risked everything to save them. Elias Voss stood near the entrance, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the heavy steel door. He wasn't listening to the machines anymore. He was listening to the silence outside. Too quiet. The outpost was never truly silent. The wind always howled through the frozen ruins, rattling old structures like bones. The occasional distant gunfire reminded them that civilization had not fully abandoned Nihilus 6, it had only turned on itself. But now, the usual noise had faded. The air felt different. Rourke was the first to break the silence. He leaned against the medbay's counter, chewing the inside of his cheek. Terran's going to make a move. Elias didn't turn. I know. Rourke exhaled. You don't seem worried. I don't waste energy on what I already expect. Sharon, still recovering, spoke with effort. This man, he is your enemy. Elias glanced at her. He's the kind of man who picks the winning side and burns the rest. Rourke grunted. Yeah, and right now we're the rest. A sharp knock echoed against the metal door. Not urgent. Not rushed. Controlled. Elias and Rourke exchanged a glance before Elias stepped forward, unholstering his sidearm. He didn't raise it, yet. The door's security monitor flickered to life, revealing a familiar face on the grainy screen. Colonel Derek Terran. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick black coat reinforced with thermal plating. His face was weathered, scarred from years of battles long forgotten. His cold, blue eyes held no malice, but neither did they hold kindness. He wasn't a man who needed anger to kill. He did it because it was practical. Flanking him were 2 heavily armed mercenaries, their armor patched together from scavenged gear. They weren't aiming their rifles yet. Elias pressed the intercom. Long way from home, Colonel. Terran's voice came through clear, smooth, and calm. I could say the same to you, Commander. Elias didn't answer. Terran tilted his head slightly, glancing past the camera. I heard you took in some unfortunate souls. Elias held his ground. I take in survivors. Terran exhaled softly, almost amused. You know our arrangement, Voss. You run your little operation, and I leave you alone. But you also know the rules. You mean your rules? Elias corrected. Terran's lips twitched in the ghost of a smirk. They work, don't they? The strong survive. The weak don't. You keep these refugees, you break that balance. They were dying, Elias said, voice level. Terran nodded slowly. Yes. And you interrupted that natural process. Silence. Elias felt Rourke tense beside him, ready for the order to fight. But Elias knew Tern. The man didn't waste bullets when words could do the same job. Tern's voice lowered, carrying the weight of a warning. Turn them over, Voss. You know how this ends otherwise. Sharon stiffened, her arms tightening around her child's small frame. She understood more than she let on. Her people had dealt with men like this before. Elias stared at the screen, then pressed the intercom again. You get nothing. Tern sighed. Disappointing. Then, he stepped back, adjusting his gloves as if the conversation had already bored him. You have until sunrise to reconsider. Elias cut the feed. Rourke swore under his breath. We just made things worse. Elias holstered his gun. They were never going to let us walk away. The countdown begins. The outpost went into full lockdown within minutes. Doors sealed. Defensive turrets activated. Every soldier inside grabbed their weapons, preparing for what they all knew was coming. Sharon sat quietly near the heat pod, her fingers gently brushing against her child's thin skin, feeling the warmth return to him. She looked up as Elias approached. You should go, she said simply. Elias crouched beside her. Not happening. She searched his face, something unreadable in her gaze. You risk your people for us. He didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure he needed to. Finally, he exhaled. If I leave you out there, I'm no better than him. Sharon studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then I fight. Elias raised a brow. You can barely stand. She flexed one of her clawed hands. I stand when I must. Rourke leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. We don't have enough guns for a full-out war. Elias stood, rolling his shoulders. We won't fight them head-on. Rourke frowned. Then what's the plan? Elias turned toward the main terminal, pulling up the outpost's exterior surveillance. Tern's men were already moving, setting up positions on the ridges overlooking the bunker. They weren't attacking yet, but they were preparing to choke them off. We outlast them, Elias said. They're expecting a surrender or a firefight. We give them neither. Rourke squinted at the screen. And if they decide to storm us? Elias pointed at the terrain. They don't have heavy artillery. Their best strategy is to wait us out, freeze us into submission. Sharon watched quietly, absorbing every word. Then we make them cold instead. Elias turned to her. How? She looked down at her hands. My kind, we absorb and release heat. Given time, I can. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Return it. Rourke frowned. Return it? Elias caught on first. You mean redirect it? Sharon nodded. A last measure. Dangerous. But possible. Elias considered this. He had read about Thorani biology before. Their bodies adapted to extreme environments, storing heat internally like living batteries. If she could weaponize that. Rourke shook his head. That's a big risk. Elias met Sharon's gaze. Can you control it? She hesitated. Not for long. The commander exhaled. This was a gamble, but so was everything else. We prepare for the worst, he said. Because by sunrise the worst is coming. Rourke grunted. Better get to work then. The night stretched on. The wind howled. Tern's men waited in the snow, patient hunters watching their prey. Inside the outpost, Elias and his people worked. Setting traps. Fortifying defenses. And in the heart of it all, Sharon sat, cradling her child, her body slowly absorbing what little heat remained. Tomorrow, it would begin. Tomorrow, everything would change. And neither side would walk away unscathed. The first shot cracked through the frozen air just before dawn. Elias Voss had been expecting it. He stood near the reinforced barricade at the outpost's main entrance, watching the shadows shift in the storm. Tern's men had been waiting all night, crouched behind ice formations and the skeletal remains of ruined structures. Now they were moving. Contact, East Ridge! Rourke's voice cut through the calms. Two-man sniper team. Trying to get a line of sight. Elias pressed a finger to his earpiece. Copy. Keep them pinned. Don't waste ammo. Another shot rang out, striking the metal plating near the entrance, leaving a fist-sized dent. Elias didn't flinch. This was a test, a warning. Tern wanted them to know he wasn't bluffing. Inside the outpost, Sharon sat against the wall, her child bundled tightly in the thickest thermal gear they had. Her breath came slow, measured. She was focused. Heat coiled inside her, stored like a charged weapon. Not yet, Elias told her. She barely nodded, eyes closing. She understood the stakes. The next wave came swiftly. A dozen mercenaries surged through the snow, darting between cover, their rifles barking. Elias ducked as a round pinged off the barricade near his head. He raised his weapon, fired twice. A man dropped into the frost, unmoving. Rourke's voice cut in again. They're getting desperate. They should be, Elias muttered. Tern had underestimated them. He thought they'd be weak, outmatched. But Elias had fought in wars bigger than this, against enemies stronger than mercenaries playing king of the wasteland. A grenade arced toward them. Down! Elias grabbed Sharon and pulled her behind cover as the explosion tore into the barricade, sending chunks of metal and ice flying. Alarms blared inside the outpost. The whole structure shook. Elias coughed, shaking off the ringing in his ears. Rourke, report. Still breathing, came the reply. But they're pushing hard. Elias peeked over the cover. Tern's forces had closed the distance, advancing in a tight formation. Too tight. His lips curled in a grim smile. He pressed the detonator. A series of underground charges, buried beneath the snow, erupted. White-hot fire and shrapnel tore through the attackers. The air filled with smoke and screams. The advance stalled. But not for long. More figures emerged from the storm, led by a familiar silhouette. Tern. The colonel moved with precision, stepping over the bodies of his fallen men without pause. His weapon hung loose at his side, but Elias knew better than to think him unarmed. The two men locked eyes. Tern lifted a hand. His soldiers stopped. Then, he spoke, voice carrying over the wind. Vas. Let's not drag this out. Elias exhaled, gripping his rifle. He stepped out, ignoring Rourke's curse in his earpiece. The two men stood a few feet apart, snow whipping between them. You should have left this alone, Tern said. Elias tilted his head. You should have learned by now that I don't take orders. Tern sighed. You always had that problem. Elias tightened his grip. We're not giving them up. Tern studied him for a long moment. Then, almost lazily, he reached for his sidearm. Elias moved first. A single shot rang out. Tern staggered, blood blossoming against his coat. He didn't fall. Instead, he smiled. You always were fast, he murmured. Then he fired. Elias twisted at the last second. The bullet grazed his side, searing pain through his ribs. He gritted his teeth, steadying himself. Tern didn't hesitate. He lunged. The two men crashed into the snow, grappling for control. Elias drove an elbow into Tern's ribs. The colonel retaliated with a brutal punch to Elias's jaw, knocking him onto his back. Tern loomed over him, gun aimed at his head. Elias didn't flinch. Because he wasn't the only one moving. Behind them, Sharon stood. Her body trembled, but not from weakness. From heat. The stored energy in her core ignited, a pulse of raw thermal force radiating outward. The frost beneath her feet melted instantly. The very air shimmered. Tern's expression barely had time to shift before the wave hit him. He was lifted off his feet, hurled backward like a rag doll. He crashed into the snow, steam rising from his armor where the heat had seared through it. His soldiers recoiled, confusion flashing across their faces. Sharon collapsed to her knees, breath ragged. Elias pushed himself up, wiping blood from his mouth. He stepped toward Tern, standing over him. The colonel coughed, struggling to rise. His coat was scorched, his breath unsteady. Elias leveled his rifle. This is over. Tern looked up, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he chuckled. I should have killed you when I had the chance. Elias didn't answer. Tern's soldiers hesitated, uncertain. Their leader was down. Their advantage was gone. Elias made the choice for them. Take him and leave. They didn't argue. Two of them moved forward, dragging Tern to his feet. The colonel didn't resist. He met Elias's gaze one last time. This world doesn't forgive weakness, he said. Elias met his eyes. Then it's a good thing we're stronger than you. Tern smirked. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the storm. The remaining mercenaries followed. Silence settled. Elias exhaled, shoulders relaxing. He turned to Sharon, who was still kneeling, exhaustion evident in every breath. Her child, now awake, reached for her. Elias crouched beside her. You okay? She nodded weakly. We live. He helped her up, steadying her. Yeah, he murmured. We do. The wind howled, but this time, it carried something different. Not fear. Not death. But hope. The battle was over, but the aftermath still lingered in the air. Smoke curled from the scorched snow, the scent of burned metal and charred fabric mixing with the frozen wind. Tern and his men had disappeared into the wasteland, leaving only silence and the dead behind. Elias Voss stood at the edge of the battlefield, his breath misting in the frigid air. His ribs ached from the fight, the bruises deep beneath his armor. He wiped the blood from his split lip, gaze scanning the outpost. They had won, but the cost of survival was never free. Rourke approached, stepping carefully over the wreckage. They won't stay gone forever. Elias nodded. He already knew that. Tern was too pragmatic to throw more men into a losing fight, but he wasn't the kind to forget. Next time, he'd come prepared. We leave, Elias said. Rourke frowned. You sure? We stay, we die. We need to move before they regroup. Rourke ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling sharply. Where? Elias turned toward the horizon. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the storm-heavy sky. Beyond them, past the ice fields, lay an old, long-abandoned colony site. Few dared to travel that far, but it was their best chance at avoiding another confrontation. We go north. Rourke muttered a curse. That's a suicide run. It's a way out, Elias countered. Tern won't chase us into the mountains. Not in this storm. Rourke hesitated, then nodded. I'll get the supplies ready. Elias turned back to the outpost. Inside, the survivors were waiting. Preparations. Sharon sat near the heat pod, her son bundled against her chest. The exhaustion was clear in her movements, but she no longer trembled. The fire inside her had dimmed, but not gone out. Elias crouched beside her. We're moving. She studied him. Where? North. Past the ridges? Her mandibles clicked slightly, an expression of contemplation. Many do not return from there. Elias nodded. That's why it's our best chance. Sharon glanced at her son, then back at Elias. You risk much? He met her gaze. So do you. She held the silence for a long moment before nodding. We go. Rourke entered, arms full of ration packs. Supplies are tight, but we can stretch it. Elias glanced at the worn packs. Not enough for a long journey, but enough to make it through the worst of it. If they moved fast, they had a chance. We leave in an hour. Sharon adjusted her grip on her child, rising to her feet. We are ready. Into the white. The storm hit as they moved out. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, turning the world into a swirling haze of gray and white. The cold gnawed at them, cutting through their gear, seeping into every exposed inch of skin. Elias led the way, steps careful but determined. His visor barely helped in the low visibility, and every few feet, he had to pause to make sure they were still heading in the right direction. Sharon walked beside him, her child wrapped tightly against her chest. Despite the brutal wind, she pressed forward without complaint. Rourke grumbled behind them. Remind me again why we couldn't just fight to the death like normal people. Elias didn't bother answering. They pressed on, pushing through waist-high drifts, the wind howling like a living thing around them. Every step felt heavier than the last. Then movement. Elias raised a fist, signaling a halt. Something was ahead. Through the storm, dark shapes shifted against the white horizon. Not human. Sharon stiffened. We are not alone. Elias tightened his grip on his weapon. Stay close. The figures emerged, tall, skeletal things, their elongated limbs moving with unnatural grace. Their bodies shimmered, blending seamlessly with the snow, their glowing eyes the only thing betraying their presence. Ice wraiths. Rourke muttered under his breath. Of course. Because mercenaries weren't enough. The wraiths didn't attack. Not yet. They moved in slow, deliberate circles, studying the intruders in their territory. Elias kept his weapon low. Firing first would be a mistake. Sharon watched them carefully. They hunt the lost. Elias met her gaze. We're not lost. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped forward. The wraiths tensed, shifting at her movement. Sharon didn't falter. Her voice, though quiet, carried through the storm. We pass. We do not trespass. The creatures tilted their heads, considering her. Elias remained still, fingers resting near his rifle, waiting. One of the wraiths took a step forward, its gaze locking onto Sharon's child. A long pause. Then, the creature let out a low, whispering sound, something almost melodic. And just like that, the wraiths vanished, melting back into the storm. Rourke let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Well, that was horrifying. Elias glanced at Sharon. How did you know that would work? She adjusted the wrap around her child. They do not take the dying. Elias considered that, then nodded. They kept moving. Dawn. By the time they reached the first ridge, the storm had begun to break. The wind slowed. The sky, once an endless void of gray, lightened with the first hints of sunrise. Elias turned back, looking at the path they had carved through the wasteland. No sign of Terran's men. No sign of the wraiths. They had made it. Sharon stood beside him, watching the sky shift. The sun returns. Elias nodded. Yeah. She looked at him. You saved us. He exhaled. Maybe. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You are different from the others. Elias glanced at her. I just made a choice. She shook her head. No. You made the right one. The wind carried their words away. Behind them, the others waited. A long journey still lay ahead. The mountains would not be kind. But for the first time in a long while, there was something else. Not just survival. Not just escape. But a future. And for now, that was enough.